this. They stood in front of a huge gate with the inscription Changchi Academy. Everyone remained silent. He thought that this gate was simply terrible. Maybe it was not too late to choose another academy? The girl walked up to them from behind and asked, "What?" They felt ashamed when they looked at their gate. They may not be worried, she felt the same way when she first saw it. However, after the words of their director, she realized that even such an art has a deep meaning. Lin Han asked, "What did the director say?" She replied, "He said that after training in their academy, they will become powerful masters. They will not be ashamed to declare themselves and stretch their hands to the sky, and this gate will be the symbol of their goal. After completing their training, this gate will be the place from which they will set off on their great path." Lin Han folded his arms and said, "Well, it doesn't look so bad." She said her name is Feng Yun, she is a senior. He also introduced himself and they shook hands. "The reception hall of Changchi Academy, there?" she asked. "So he was the same Lin Han who won first place in the exam? They say he is the only support player in the world who can kill a monster with one hit." He scratched his head awkwardly and said that rumors are always exaggerated. She happily said that she was lucky enough to meet this year's top star on the first day. She took his hand and said that she would take him to the reception room. A guy appeared in front of them with a sparkling bouquet. He said that he felt that he and Feng Yun were supposed to meet there. After all, their souls are connected by an unbreakable bond. She asked displeasedly, "What kind of bond is he talking about?" It's time for him to stop pursuing her. He asked her not to be so cold. Then he noticed Lin Han and asked, "Is this one of the applicants?" Did she decide to personally escort him? She said that this was Lin Han, the strongest disciple of Huiwa City, so she decided to help him with the admission procedure. He asked in surprise, "Lin Han?" But then the guy called him an adult. Lin Han can handle it himself, and he needs to talk to Feng Yun. The protagonist stretched out his hand and said, "It seems she doesn't really want to talk to him." The guy and the other students began to laugh. He said that Lin Han was funny. He won first place in the exam in his city. But does he really think that now he is allowed to behave so insolently with the elders in the academy alone? He threw a bouquet of flowers to one of the students and smirked. He said, "His family supports the academy. There is not a single person in the city who does not respect his family. And now he dared to stop him?" Everyone began to laugh and say that Lin Han did not have time to enter the academy, and he already insulted the Zhang family. Where do such bold people come from? The second guy asked where the masters of the academy were looking. How did such a fool get into them? He was pleased with such words and asked, "Did Lin Han hear this? It is not worth bothering the members of the Zhang family while he is in their city. But he is a big-hearted guy, so he will give him another chance. If Lin Han joins their group, he will forget about today's incident. Otherwise, it will be very difficult for him to study in their academy." The protagonist glared at him and said that he was tired of this. It would be better for them to get out of his way. At that moment, Jianan flew into the wall and hit it hard, making a hole in it. His friends were scared and started calling for him. Feng Yun said that it was not bad. They ran up to the guy and grabbed him in their arms. They called for him until he did not hear them and blood flowed from his mouth. One of the guys screamed, "Is he completely crazy? How dare he hit his senior like that?" As they took him away, Feng Yun looked at it contentedly, and another girl came up from behind them. Her confident gait and beautiful appearance made everyone get out of the way. He asked in a trembling and frightened voice, "Senior Fei Hua? When did she come back?" She angrily told him not to mention this person in front of her. She showed him the letter and asked, "Is this the admission of new students?" "Here is her letter. She wants to finish this as soon as possible." The guy asked, "Is this a new student, but does she look so much like the same one?" The worker in front of her also asked fearfully, "Fei Hua? He will do it now." Lin Han thought, "Is this Fei Hua's younger sister?" He walked to the table and handed over the letter, saying that he is also a new student. Can they register him? He seemed to sparkle and said, "Apparently they will study together." He also introduced himself. She snorted and displeasedly told him not to talk to her. It will not work. He thought that she was more arrogant than even her older sister. Well, this is a waste of time. It is better to just forget about her. He smiled and asked, since he has already completed the registration, can he go to the dorm room? The worker said, of course, he should follow the map they gave him. Changchi Academy's male dormitory. The protagonist stood at the door with his luggage and knocked, asking if there was anyone there. The door was opened and the guy said he was on his way. He greeted him and introduced himself, and then asked if he was his roommate. Suddenly, the door slammed shut in front of him, and he wondered in surprise, what was that? A second later, The door was opened again, and the guy looked at him with a strange expression. Then he blushed and abruptly held out a notebook, loudly saying that his name was Ting Shinchi, a level 6 Silver Thunder mage and his roommate. He asked if Mr. Lin could give him his autograph. He looked at him in shock and wondered if he was one of those fans. He took the notebook and laughed awkwardly, saying that they were roommates. He shouldn't address him so respectfully. What about the other roommates? Shinchi asked with delight. How could it be otherwise? Lin Han is the only golden stage altar in the world. He knew that Shinchi was right, but why act like he saw some rare beast? A muscular guy came up from behind them and laughed. He said, "It's amazing that his roommate would be such a famous Lin Han." He also introduced himself. His name is Gunsung Lianqi. He is a level 9 silver stage spearman. Shocked, Shinchi asked, "Is he Lianqi, the 6th young master of the Gunsung family?" The protagonist thought, is he a descendant of one of the 5 great families? It seems that he is destined to constantly encounter members of these families. He laughed and awkwardly scratched the back of his head, saying, "Yeah, well, he hopes that they will be friends. After all, they will have to live together for the next 4 years." Yuanxi came and asked in surprise, "Lin Han, the 6th young master of Lianqi, who even assigned students to rooms?" Lin Han hugged him and asked, "Is there something wrong? Doesn't he feel happy about the idea of them living in the same room?" "He doesn't have to worry." Lin Han almost forgot how arrogant and haughty he was. The protagonist happily said that it was his brother Yuan, asking them to treat him well. Lianqi said that it was incredible. 2 golden stage masters would be staying in their room. Would they like to have a dinner together to celebrate their first meeting if he treated them? Everyone said that it was a great idea. Shinchi burst into tears of happiness, and said that it would be a great honor for him to have dinner with them. Lin Han hoped that Lianqi would not regret his words when he saw the bill. There were various cafes and clubs in the tall building. They came to one of these places. Yuan was confused and asked, "Isn't this too luxurious for them? This restaurant is bigger than the largest hotel, and this is only the first floor." Lianqi said that the restaurant on the first floor is the only place where you can buy something with money. On the other floors only points are accepted. On the second floor and above, not only are rarer dishes sold, but also some materials that can make a person stronger. In addition, you can enjoy a massage, a relaxing bath and other services there. Lin Han asked in surprise, what points are he talking about? He replied that in the academy, points are valued more than money. There, with the help of points, you can solve almost any problem. Shinchi said admiringly, "Lianqi is worthy of the title of a descendant of one of the 5 great families. He knows a lot." A worker came to them and said that the room was ready. She asked them to follow her. They entered a private room and cheerfully said, "Hooray, it's time to celebrate the acquaintance." They clinked glasses, and then Lianqi said that the holders of all classes had gathered in their room. He thinks that they will be able to get good seats at the freshman meeting. The protagonist asked, "Is the freshman meeting some kind of welcoming party?" Lianqi replied, "No, it is not exactly a welcoming party. It is more like a battle for the distribution of resources of Changchi Academy. The more students he defeats in that battle, the more resources he will get from the academy. It is said that last year, the academy promised 10% of all resources to whoever defeats 20 opponents in a row." Yuan asked displeasedly, 20 opponents in a row, is this even possible? Lianqi replied, "Of course it is possible. After all, a few years ago, one of the students set a record for the academy and appropriated 60% of the resources. He heard that she recently entered the supreme stage." Lin Han tensed up and thought, it seemed like Fei Hua had bragged to him about something like that before. Is there really still legends about her in Changchi Academy? Suddenly, there was a knock on their door. Someone told them to leave. He had been waiting for them for 30 minutes. If they did not come out, he would have to force them. The protagonist opened the door and saw Jianan with a crowd of guys. He said angrily, "It was Lin Han. He was only a freshman. Are you sure he can spend money like this?" He smirked and asked what happened. Did he enjoy getting hit? If he wanted, they could do it again, but these words made Jianan even more angry. He pointed his finger at him and shouted. He didn't take him seriously that time, but it wouldn't happen again. He would show him what happens to those who don't respect their elders, so he had to get out. Feng Yun and her friend came out of the other room. She asked irritably, "Did he decide to start a fight in a restaurant? Jianan, does he want all his points taken away?" He turned around and asked Feng Yun. He immediately blushed and said with a smile that it was already quite late, he could give her a ride. She said dissatisfiedly that she didn't need it, she would walk. The freshmen weren't even at their first meeting, he should stop causing them trouble. He scratched his head and awkwardly said that he didn't mean to do that. It wasn't worth ruining her mood. He started to leave and angrily said that the fool Lin Han was just lucky. They were leaving. Shan Shan walked up to him and patted him on the shoulder with a smile. He was not a coward. Why were you so angry at Jianan? Did you really fall in love with Fengyan? She walked up and told her friend to stop talking nonsense, and Lin Han could just call her if Jianan started to misbehave again. He was embarrassed and thanked his older sister, and the girl asked, "Have they exchanged numbers yet?" "They are definitely a couple." Fengyan was embarrassed and screamed that she was going to rip her mouth apart. Shan Shan ran away and laughed. She said she was sorry. Well, they will meet again. Lin Han looked at them in confusion and thought that the students of Changchi Academy were too energetic. Yuan hugged him and blushed and asked, "Is he flirting with a senior girl right after entering?" He underestimated him. The protagonist clenched his fists and asked, "Yuan underestimated him. How can he best dispel doubts?" Yuan fell to his knees and said that he was to blame. Said too much? Lin Han thought it was strange. Jianan left, but he felt someone's hostility. He said that Yuan was already very drunk. It was better to take him to his room so that he did not have time to disgrace himself in front of the entire academy. Everyone supported his idea and decided to go back. But they were really being followed. At night the door to their room opened. Yuan was sleeping and he was feeling bad. At this time, an assassin was watching him. He began to approach his bed with a dagger, and when he was about to stick the blade in, Lin Han stopped him. He smiled and said that he had noticed him a long time ago. Who was he? The guy snatched the weapon and jumped out the window, but Lin Han followed him and they began to run further and further. After a while, they ran to the cemetery of the Changchi Academy. Lin Han tried to hit the assassin, but missed. The guy waved his dagger and said, he knows Lin Han is strong, but there is no point if he can't hit, so he's better off dead. He frowned and looked to the side, catching the guy's elbow. He grabbed it tightly and he was surprised. The protagonist thrust a dagger into the opponent's chest with his own hand. The blow made the killer bleed from his mouth. He asked how? Lin Han let him go with his own hand in his chest and said that he had already fought against a guy with the same skills. They both become material at the moment of their attacks, otherwise they simply could not hurt the enemy. A black aura appeared around the guy. He said if they do not get rid of him, he will soon become a problem. He began to change. He was surrounded by terrible streams of dark and bloody magic. But then the monster fell to his knees. The head of the academy came up from behind and clapped. He said, "So Lin Han can determine the weaknesses of the enemy in the first seconds." The protagonist turned out to be even more capable than he thought. He told Director Su that there was something wrong with the academy's security system. They were almost killed by a strange cultist. The director sighed and said that it seemed that the intruder used a special technique that allowed him to remain undetected by the detection system. He would increase patrols so that this would not happen again. Of course, he would give him points as compensation. He said dissatisfiedly that at least this was something. Director Su asked if he could tell who it was and why he wanted to kill him. He shrugged his hands and said that he himself did not know. He had felt aura of hostility even in the restaurant. It was not directed specifically at him, or anyone else. He felt like it was directed at all the freshmen. Headmaster, she said that it seemed that someone was targeting their academy. Troubled times were approaching. He asked, by the way, how was Fei Hua? Had she recovered yet? He nervously said yes. And he thought to himself, no, how could he blurt out such a thing? What if he guesses the true identity of the mysterious master? The director said that he knew it. He doesn't have to worry. They don't want to spoil the relationship with his master. On the contrary, it would be good to establish communication. But it's late. It's time for him to go back to his room. In a couple of days there will be a freshman's meeting. He hopes that Lin Han will not disappoint him. The director began to leave, and Lin Han frowned. If Director Su guessed, then the other great families could also guess. Fortunately, he managed to show the strength of his master. They won't put pressure on him, knowing that the master's wrath will fall on them. Changchi Academy Arena. A girl came out on stage and said that they were happy to see new students at the Changchi Academy freshmen's meeting. Everyone shouted happily, and Shinchi asked, don't they think it's too much? From the outside, one would think that some popular band was having a concert there. Lianxi laughed and said that this is one of the top 5 academies. Everything is as it should be. The girl said that the vice principal would now say a few words to them. He said that the freshmen's meeting at their academy could be called a kind of tournament, during which the students would face each other and the seniors. Depending on how they performed in the battle, the judge would award the winner with corresponding points. If any of them could pass this test and defeat 5 seniors, they would receive 10% of all the resources of the academy this year. Confetti appeared on the stage and he said that their academy had not only basic cultivation methods, but also special techniques. These techniques would allow them to reveal their talents, strengthen their fighting spirit, and become stronger. They have to prove to him that those who excel in the high school graduation exam are worthy of being called real monsters. The students laughed and said that the vice principal is good, he can definitely be called a monster. One guy was serious and said that he will prove that he is worthy of the title of monster. The protagonist looked at this noise indifferently and thought, this is to be expected from the vice principal. With just a few words he inspired the crowd. Changchi Academy shouts that everything depends only on them. He thinks they are right. In a fierce competition, progress is fast. They are trying to cultivate real geniuses, and Fei Hua has managed to become a legend of this academy. She is incredible. The vice principal said that then they will drop the talk and start the tournament. All the students were surprised and looked up. They asked what happened to the roof. Does it retract? The roof opened completely, and they found themselves in a large stadium, and a huge stage appeared in the center. The vice principal said that the students should show everything they are capable of in the arena. Suddenly everyone started making noise, someone jumped incredibly high, and the guy said, he will definitely show his strength, he came for victory. The same guy who flew over them appeared on the stage, he said that today he will be their senior. They can approach him and not be shy, do not worry, he will not hit back, but he does not promise that they will not suffer from their own blow. The protagonist said that this senior student is acting strangely, and Lianxi replied, given his nature then this is not strange. Does he know him? Lianxi thought about it, and said that he heard about him. It seems that he is a warrior with a very rare Vajra body class. He becomes stronger every time someone defeats him, so he can become stronger not only by destroying monsters. At this time, a student tried to fight him on the stage, but he was having a hard time, and the senior was glowing with an aura, and when he straightened up, the student flew very far away. He laughed and said that the guy was brave, but it was still not enough to defeat him. He began to tell the freshmen to come closer and not let the seniors look down on them. Lianxi approached him from above with a cloud of dark magic and said that he was about to see it. He hit him, but the student did not move. He was protected by a barrier, and a bright flash and lightning appeared from the blow. He said he was sorry. Lianxi was close, but he could only leave a small crack. He still admitted that for his age, Lianxi was strong. With time he might have enough strength to win. Lin Han appeared from behind and asked, would the senior let him try? He smirked and asked, try? Of course, that was why he came out to them. Lin Han could spare no effort and hit. Lin Han concentrated and a bright cloud of magic appeared in his hand. He approached and also hit him, but hit the barrier. The flash was even brighter and the lightning was bigger. Even the half of the stage began to collapse. The senior student was holding the barrier with great difficulty. The protagonist continued to press and finally the barrier shattered into pieces, and the senior fell to the stage screaming. All the students were shocked. Is this a joke? Is he really a freshman? They hope that he will not fight them, otherwise it will be fatal. The vice principal raised his hand and said that student Lin Han earned 10 points for being able to pierce the body of the Vajra. So, is there anyone willing to challenge him? Jian appeared on the stage and said, of course. Yuan asked in surprise, Senior Fei Hua, when did she have time to quarrel with Lin Han? No, something is wrong, the style is different, and she looks younger. He also thought that her face was too stern. Are they related? She seemed to sense it, and said displeasedly, apparently this stupid sister used her name again to get into trouble. She said Lin Han, then she starts. Her hands began to be shrouded in shadow, and then her whole body emitted many dark streams of magic. She used the skill triple shadow kill. The protagonist blocked the blow of a large shadow and was surprised. He thought that these were illusions, but it turned out that the attacks were material. He dodged again, but this was to be expected from Fei Hua's younger sister. He countered her shadow, and then closed his eyes. Well, it seems he will have to show his real skills. He used the Eye of Truth and Jian tensed up. As if a huge eye was looking at her, she asked what was going on. It was as if she was being seen through. He proudly said that the Eye of Truth was able to catch even the smallest details. Her shadow movement was useless against him. He sees everything. He stood with his eyes closed, but the shadows could not attack him. Then he suddenly opened his eyes and said that he found her. He smiled and punched straight into the thick shadow. There was Jian, and he stopped his fist near her face. She took her form and sighed, saying that she would admit his victory. She walked out of the arena dissatisfied and said that they would have a rematch someday. The vice principal said that student Lin Han had defeated freshman Jian and earned 15 points. Who else would challenge him? The students asked each other, who would dare to fight him after he had defeated the strongest students? Yes, he did not want to fight this monster. The girl looked at them and said, "What is this? How can they not be ashamed to act like this in front of the freshmen?" It seems that she herself will have to play with the junior for a while. She jumped on the stage towards him and hit him with her whip, greeting him. But Jianan appeared in front of her and told her to wait. He angrily said that Lin Han had first attacked him secretly. Then he escaped thanks to Fengyun. But today he will not leave so easily. He will make him pay for disrespecting his seniors and the Zhang family. She asked, "Why is Jianan interrupting them? Lin Han will fight her." But he said that this guy is acting wrong. He is proposing to beat him together. He is finished. The protagonist folded his arms and asked, "Zhang Jianan, why is he throwing around such big words while having mediocre skills? Do you want to lie on the ground again?" Jianan replied dissatisfiedly, "Lin Han, him. Last time, he was just lucky. He attacked him when he was not prepared for it. This time, it will be different." He turned around and ordered Hongyun to use her magic on him. He will fight from the front. Hongyun frowned and replied, Okay, just let him not run headlong." Yuanshi walked up to the judge and pointed his finger forward and asked, "Judge, is it okay for the two of them to team up against Lin Han alone?" The judge frowned and replied, "There are no rules in the tournament, so it is only logical that they decided to overwhelm him with numbers. The battle begins." Yuanshi shouted in displeasure, "What, there are no rules? Is this even normal?" Hongyun waved her weapon and ordered to flare up and blaze. Jianan was covered in energy, and clenched his fists and laughed. He cried out, "What a pleasant feeling!" He frowned and said he admits that one is strong, Lin Han. However, even he will not be pleased to hit this flame armor with his bare hands. He will crush him, break all his limbs and make him beg for forgiveness. Jianan rushed forward and ordered to receive Flame Fist. Lin Han folded his arms across his chest and grinned and replied, "Supreme Fire Magic, of course, is another affliction, but it is not something he should be afraid of." He put his hand forward and blocked the guy's strike. The protagonist smiled and offered to demonstrate the difference in their strength. Jianan looked forward in confusion, when suddenly Lin Han began to swing his body. He swung and spun Jianan's body. The judge squinted in confusion and said he enveloped his hands in healing light and almost nullified the effectiveness of the flame armor, and then spun it so that all of Jianan's flames simply dissipated. The protagonist swung and threw him forward, forming a large tornado. He clenched his fist and sent it towards Hongyun. Lin Han stopped right in front of her face, and she screamed in fear. He smirked and asked, "Elder sister, she is a mage, right? Then just give up." At this moment, Jianan fell to the ground behind him and split the ground. He opened his mouth and spread his arms out in different directions. Yuanmi smirked and shouted loudly, "Elder, his flame armor was completely useless." Jianan stood up and shook himself off, saying discontentedly, "Lin Han, his Zhang family will never forgive him for this." The protagonist wondered why all the children of great families were so similar. He should have at least chosen different words. Hongyun raised her hands and said she gives up. "Junior Lin Han, he is too strong. Even if they united, they could not cope with him. By the way, they should have more frequent sparring sessions. It will be useful for both of them. And also, she is excited by the mere thought that they are with her." At this moment, a guy from the crowd of spectators screamed, "This is a real monster. Can he really break Senior Feihua's record?" The spectator looked at him and asked, "Dude, does he think he understands demons like them?" He suggested that they just watch from the sidelines. Lin Han turned around and shouted, "Deputy Director, he wants to continue the tournament. But fighting each opponent one by one is too boring. He wants to go straight to the last stage of the tournament." The judge spread his arms out and laughed. He didn't think that this year there would be a freshman who would reach the last stage. He didn't disappoint him, Lin Han. If he could defeat 5 Diamond Stage seniors at once, he would receive 10% of the entire Kaoki Academy for the whole year. Lin Han looked ahead at the squad and thought that physical strength alone would not be enough to deal with 5 early stage Supreme Stage Masters. But he didn't want to reveal too many trump cards either, otherwise he would get into trouble. The protagonist raised his hand and cried out, "Deputy Director," he wished he had a team too. The judge replied that he could pick 4 more, he would give him 10 minutes to prepare. But he warned that a hastily assembled team would not be able to compete with people who had been through dozens of battles together. Lin Han looked down and waved his hand, telling the brothers to get up. Gong Sunlian stood up and said he didn't think he would be able to participate in the final battle of the tournament. The protagonist placed his fist on his palm and looked forward. Gong Sunlian looked at him and said, "But Lin Han, they are still missing one. Does he have anyone in mind?" Lin Han turned around and replied that he would rather do without the uncontrollable variable. After all, not everyone there is eager to see their victory. At this moment, Du-Wan waved her hand and asked if she would come. The protagonist chuckled and thought, Du-Wan, did she also enter this academy? If he remembered correctly, she is a mage. This girl will perfectly compensate for the shortcomings of their team. Lin Han waved his hand and said, "Okay, let her get up." Gong Sunlian, and he smiled and looked away. But Yuan Shi and Ting Xinqi looked ominous and wary. Du-Wan stood up and looked around fearfully, pressing her hands to her chest. In front of them were members of the other team, knights and mages. The referee waved his hand and shouted, "Both teams are ready." He gave the order to begin the fight. The girl in armor rushed forward, clutching the hilt of a sword. She swung and tried to strike at the protagonist, but he quickly blocked the attack. The girl screamed. Zhang Jianan was right, he was amazingly strong. However, he was also right that he should show more respect to his elders. Lin Han smiled and thanked them for the praise. "But don't they think their armor looks too bulky?" He burst into laughter just looking at it. The girl jumped back and asked in displeasure, "What kind of nonsense is he talking about? Armor is supposed to be like this. She will never accept this newfangled elegant armor that only covers vital parts. Her armor is 1,000 times cooler." Suddenly, green vines tied the arms and legs of the protagonist's team. The mage extended her staff and screamed, "He thinks they have time to talk in the middle of a fight?" The plants turned into big monsters with toothy mouths. The girl screamed, "Life magic!" The vines lifted Du-Wan's body and pulled her to the big toothy mouth. The mage laughed and said, "Under the onslaught of her little ones, no one will be able to roam to their fullest. How did such a small and fragile girl get into the cruel tournament arena? Let her return her to her pink room." Gong Sunlian began to cut the vines and laughed and asked, "Half?" The guy swung his sickles and said, "Young Master Gong Sun, first he will have to deal with him." Yuan Shi rushed forward at the knight, and Ting Xinqi put up an energy block in front of the other team's mage's energy. Du-Wan ordered not to worry about her, she would handle it herself. She screamed, "Thunder magic, heavenly thunder." Lightning began to strike the eyes of the plant monsters, and the girl laughed and said that it was not bad, however. "Little one, doesn't she know that plants do not conduct electricity?" The monsters began to burn with bright flames and the girl coughed discontentedly from the smoke and said, "What a naughty little one she got." So thunder magic was just a distraction. Then she almost immediately released low-rank fire magic. So she is a dual attribute mage? After a while, Du-Wan turned away and began to vomit. She wiped her mouth and said, "It feels better now." "No, she is not that class." The girl waved her staff and sent the vines forward. She screamed. No matter how many attributes she had, she still couldn't escape her wood blades. Du-Wan put her hands forward and said, "They'll see about that." She created a large bell-shaped dome in front of her, and the vines slammed into it. The girl looked at it in fear and asked, "What? How did she do that?" Director Chu looked at it and thought, "Isn't that Wei Zhiqiani's body? So she's 1,000 changes class holder? An excellent class. Thanks to this, she can now fight equally with students who have already reached the supreme stage." The protagonist blocked the strike with his staff and said, "It seems he doesn't need to worry about his comrades, they're doing just fine on their own." The knight looked at him and laughed and said not to worry, they've only just begun. Soon, even he'll have a hard time. The mage raised his staff and shouted, "He's finished, it's time to show them what the senior students of their academy can do." Phantom Flame. At this moment, Ting Xinqi moved to Du-Wan and cast magic. He shouted, "Not so fast, Black Lightning." The energy flow shot forward and hit the vines and ghost flames. There was an explosion, and the boys' bodies were thrown back. The girl laughed and said, "His Black Lightning was quite good." However, their combination attack was many times stronger. The girl laughed again and said that with their silver stages, there was no way they could withstand this. Gong Sunlian swung his spear and said, "Their stage is much higher than theirs. In addition to this, they have been fighting together for a long time, so they have already worked out certain combinations. Sooner or later they will simply crush them." He thinks the most effective thing is to just attack head-on and show everything they can do. Yuan Shi shouted, "He supports." The boys ran forward and shouted, "Let's go." Gong Sunlian used the shadow of 1,000 spears, and Yuan she used a deadly slash. A large stream of energy was directed towards the knights, and the guys were thrown back. They hit their backs on the walls and looked forward, where the members of the enemy team were standing. The spectator looked at the knight in surprise and asked, "What, was that a girl?" The girl looked at him with displeasure and asked, "What are you staring at? If he looks at her again, she will poke out his eyes." The protagonist ducked and said, and he was wondering which of them was the support in the team. It turns out that she just hid behind a huge shield. He admits that even in close combat she is not as weak as other support class owners, so he mistook her for a warrior. The knight laughed and replied, "Yes, this is their special tactic designed for fighting people. Lin Han, he is alone, it is better for him to surrender right away." Lin Han adjusted his hair and asked, "Surrender?" He doesn't think it's a good idea, they've just started. Yes, he was left alone, but he learned everything he needed to know about them. In addition, his comrades weren't unharmed either. The protagonist rushed forward and the knight looked at him puzzled. The mage put his hand forward and activated the seal and said, "Wall of Flame." Lin Han swung his fist and passed through the seal, hitting the mage. At that moment, vines appeared from under the stones again and grabbed the protagonist's body. The girl laughed and said, "He won't pass, go ahead, her little ones." Lin Han jerked his hands and looked ahead with displeasure. He threw the vines over the warrior's hands, and she asked what he was doing. Suddenly, the vine covered the mage's girl's body, and she looked at it in fear. A loud scream was heard and the audience opened their mouths in surprise. The protagonist tied the girls' bodies and smiled, and they screamed loudly and were embarrassed. Lin Han turned around and looked at the guys and said, "Now there are only the two of them left." The judge frowned in surprise and said he guessed the moment well when the support was unprotected, and then, when his attack was blocked, he quickly switched to another target. Strength, speed and reflexes are simply impeccable. He thinks that in time he will turn into the same monster as Feihua. No, he will even surpass her. The knight pointed at Lin Han and said, "He is no slouch." Instantly took advantage of the gap and knocked out 3 of their mages and supports at once. He did not expect this from the younger one. The protagonist spread his arms in different directions and said, "He is flattered. He is also very good, the elder. However, he would become even cooler if he got rid of this strange armor." The guy grabbed the knight by the arms and he shouted, "What did he say? How dare he call his armor strange?" The guy asked the captain to calm down, but he demanded to let him go, he would tear him to shreds. The main character looked at him from under his brows and thought that he did not think that he would find his weak spots so easily. He laughed and thought that he lost his temper because of one word. Lin Han said, "Seniors, since they are not going to attack, then he will do it." He swung and hit the ground with his staff, causing it to crack. The knight jumped to the side and swung his sword. The guy snuck up on the protagonist from the other side and swung his sickle. Lin Han grabbed the weapon with his hands, which began to drip blood from the cuts. The knight looked at him puzzled and asked, "Lin Han, has he completely lost his mind? This is just a tournament, and he is already ready to lose both his arms." The protagonist clenched his fists, smashing the weapon and said, "Thank you for your concern, senior, but he is quite a strong altar." The guys fell back and Lin Han used divine light. The bright glow healed the wounds on his hands and he smiled and said, "Forgive me, seniors, but it seems that he has already won." The audience began to chant enthusiastically, "Lin Han, Lin Han." People raised their hands and shouted joyfully. The judge smiled and announced that Lin Han had defeated 5 senior diamond stage students using only his physical strength and altar class spells. "Excellent!" He declared Lin Han the winner of this year's tournament. As a reward, the protagonist will receive 10% of all resources in Kaoki Academy for the entire year. The guy pointed at him and said, "My God, this guy was born under a lucky star. It's hard to believe that they are almost the same age." The spectator said, "And he told him that this guy is strong, he saw him back during the exams." Suddenly, Lin Han felt someone staring at him and turned around with displeasure, wondering who it was. Was there really someone even watching him? After a while, on the 2nd floor of the Kaoki Academy restaurant, in a private room, the guys clinked their mugs of foamy drink and a loud cry was heard. They were happy to welcome the elder Tianyi and sister Du Du Wan to their small company. Gong Sumlianshi was embarrassed and hiccuped and said, but he thought that he was the richest among them. But brother Lin Han earned himself a whole bunch of points in one day. Now they will drink only at the expense of brother Han. Ting Xinchi put his hand on the protagonist's shoulder and raised the mug up and said, "They will drink to brother Han." The protagonist smiled and told them to take pity on him. After a while, When it was already light, Lin Han was drinking from the mug, and all the other guys were sleeping at the table. He grinned and said, "These guys don't know how to drink at all. They will sleep again until tomorrow morning." Suddenly, he felt someone fly past behind him and opened his eyes wide. The protagonist turned around and thought, the same feeling as in the arena. Now he wondered who it was. After a while, he went outside and walked forward between the trees. Suddenly, Fei Hua peeked out from behind a rock and cast a nature spell, Stone Vice. She grabbed the hilt of her sword and struck the rocks. Lin Han activated the energy flow and ordered to get acquainted with the explosive fist of the altar. Fei Hua covered her body with her hands and the protagonist stopped right in front of her. She thoughtfully said, "And the strength is at least a diamond stage master. Just a little more, and she would be in great pain. Boss Lin, is he hiding something? Well, did he miss her?" Lin Han smiled and asked Fei Hua. She threw herself into his arms and pinched his cheek and said, "Boss Lin, he is still as charming as the last time they met." The protagonist told her to stop, "It hurts." He put his hand to his cheek and asked what she was doing there. Did she want to see her little sister? Fei Hua folded her arms across her chest and sighed with displeasure and replied, "No, if she found out she was there, she would immediately attack him with her fists." Lin Han wondered what had happened between them. He said that even though he was an altar, his blow was not easy, but she didn't care. Had she increased her stage again? The protagonist looked at her and thought, she was a real genius. Everyone knows that after reaching the supreme stage, cultivation slows down significantly. And she had increased her stage in just a couple of months. Fei Hua smiled and replied, yes, she had been clearing monsters in one dungeon for a whole month, and had risen all the way to the third stage of the supreme stage. Lin Han asked in surprise, a whole month? Don't the monsters in the dungeon disappear after the first kill? Fei Hua smiled and said, Boss Lin, he speaks like some rich guy who likes to squander money. Now Fei Hua's sister will explain everything to him. She presented a board with markings drawn in chalk and said, yes, there is a limited number of monsters in the dungeon, but each dungeon has a refresh time for these monsters. She simply did not leave the dungeon and dealt with each wave of monsters that appeared after the refresh. It is very effective, although inconvenient. The protagonist smiled and said, wow, he did not know about this. Fei Hua cried and screamed. If the dungeon owners had not kicked her out, she could have leveled there until old age, but they said that she almost drove them into debt, the mean ones. Lin Han replied, well, you can understand them too, they make money on this. Suddenly, Fei Hua turned around and asked, he had been in the academy for quite some time, so he should have known her name, right? The protagonist replied, yeah, well, he was a bit busy. Fei Hua took out her blade and asked, busy? This information was publicly available on the academy's network. Doesn't he care about it at all? Couldn't he at least pretend to be considerate of other people? Lin Han put his hand forward and asked for forgiveness, his mistake. Ruixin smiled and said, Ruixin, her name is Jiang Ruixin. Fei Hua, that's her nickname. The protagonist gave a thumbs up and laughed, and said, Ruixin, what a great name. She frowned and said, okay, jokes aside, she came there to tell him something. Does he remember that gold-rank dungeon where the Minotaur Lord suddenly showed up? Lin Han asked in surprise, did she know something? Ruixin imagined the images of people and replied, yep, this is the work of the Blood Moon sect, the largest dark sect in the world. They are said to have a special technique that allows them to absorb people's blood and turn it into their own power. And the members of this sect are also able to turn into black smoke. The protagonist put his hand to his chin and thought, the guy who attacked them last night could also turn into black smoke. So he was from the Blood Moon sect? He asked, but why did they target him so much? Yes, he is good, but he is not that special, right? Ruixin placed her hands on her hips and slightly turned her head and asked, who knows? This sect's actions have always been chaotic and unpredictable. They appear when no one expects it. At least their empire does not know the motives of those. But recently, they had been making more frequent forays, so he had managed to find out something. It seemed like they were targeting geniuses. He wasn't the only one who had been targeted, so he shouldn't flatter himself. Lin Han wondered, did they somehow find out about his system? Or did he just happen to stumble upon them when they were trying to kill some other genius? Ruixin shook her head and said, well, Boss Lin should take care of himself. She said, and yes? She suddenly fell silent, and the protagonist looked at her, puzzled. He asked why she suddenly looked so gloomy. Ruixin adjusted her hair and replied, she would soon have to join the army, so they would have to say goodbye today. Lin Han asked again, to the army? Is that necessary? Ruixin pressed herself against him and replied, yes, after all, this is her job. What's wrong? Is it so hard to say goodbye to her? Or did Mom and Dad miss her already? The protagonist was embarrassed and replied, he was just asking. Ruixin put her hand to her chin and replied, okay. She hoped that he, Boss Lin, would not let anyone hurt him. She would be very sad if she returned and only found his lifeless body. Lin Han smiled and closed his eyes and said not to worry, he was not going to leave her a widow. He looked up and folded his arms over his chest and thought, what was he even talking about? Ruixin laughed and replied, okay. She pushed off the ground and headed towards the moon. She waved her hand at him and shouted, by the way, let him look after her sister, if she gets hurt, she will kill him. The protagonist smiled and replied, yes. Suddenly, he put his hand to his chin and coughed awkwardly, thinking, this is just an army, was it worth saying goodbye as if they would never see each other again? At this moment the man was not far from them and said displeasedly, how quickly former students forget about simple respect. She burst into the academy, and did not even say hello. The academy is not a public toilet. After a while, a crowd of people stood in the quest distribution hall of the Kaoki Academy. Du-won looked ahead in surprise and said, there are so many people. Gong-sun Lianshi smiled and replied, of course, because this is where students can form teams and take on some quests in order to earn points. As he said before, points in Kaoki Academy are more valuable than money. Naturally, this does not apply to their monster brother Han. The protagonist looked at him and asked, why is he a monster then? The guy smiled and thought, does he really not understand, or is he just pretending? At this moment, the guard shouted, get out of the way, their senior is coming. Lin Han turned around and thought, what kind of clowns are these? Zhuge walked up to him and asked, is this he, the same Lin Han, the winner of the last exam of Huizhou City? The protagonist answered, yes, so what? Tianfeng lifted his chin and said, his name is Zhuge Tianfeng, and he is the winner of the last exam of Hanyun City. Lin Han, let him join him. With them, he will be able to demonstrate his talents and reach unprecedented heights. Strong people always look for their own kind, and the weak, they are only good as a stepping stone for them. Lin Han looked at him indifferently and replied, he didn't care, he already had a team. Besides, in his eyes, their so-called strongest team was just child's play. At this moment, a guard came forward and pointed his finger at the protagonist, ordering him to watch his language. Their senior gave him such an opportunity, and he turned his nose up. Ungrateful. The guy who was standing behind said, Captain Zhuge, his dog is barking too loudly. Let him quiet it down, please. Lin Han rushed forward and said, and if he is unable to rein in his six, then he will do it for him. Suddenly, a hand appeared in front of him and blocked the blow. Zhuge blocked his blow and said, Lin Han, he has never seen such naive idiots in his life. Since he still does not understand what kind of chance he has given him, then he will clearly show him the difference between the strongest team and the rest of the losers. The protagonist thought, this guy is much stronger than that idiot Zhang Jianan, he can't be defeated with a single punch. Suddenly, the director of Kaoki Academy, Su Zhongtian, came forward and asked displeasedly, what are they doing there? Do they want to lose all their points? Zhuge said in fear, Director Su. Lin Han thought, what a powerful aura, at least supreme stage. Suddenly, the director looked at the guys and asked, are they the ones who want to form a team with Lin Han, right? He then told them to follow him. After a while, they were climbing a large circular staircase. Yuanshi came closer to the protagonist and asked, what does Director Su want from them? Suddenly, Teng Xinchi turned pale and asked, maybe he wants to hang them on the tower for violating discipline? Lin Han replied, he heard that Director Su is a fair person, he will not do such a thing. Suddenly, the large gate began to open, letting in a bright light through the crack. The boys walked inside, following the director. They came out onto a high balcony with a beautiful view. Director Su said, wow, what a view. This is the highest watchtower of the academy. The whole world is teeming with strange monsters, so almost every city has its own army. However, Hanyun City does not. And all because the students of the Kaoki Academy are the army of this city. They are the ones who deal with all the monsters that pose a threat to the residents. The director imagined images of huge monsters and said, Hanyun City has already experienced 3 raids of monsters. Naturally, their academy did everything in its power to protect people, but each time the consequences were very tragic. He turned around and frowned and said, As the caretaker of these lands, he watches the behavior of monsters near the city every day. Recently, he noticed that the movements of these have changed. Perhaps this is all just a coincidence, and nothing will happen, but he cannot turn a blind eye to the potential threat. Lin Han asked, "How can they help, Director?" Director Su spread his hands out in different directions and replied, he would like to place his hopes for a bright future on them. If they become stronger as soon as possible, their chances of fighting off the monster's raid will increase significantly. Therefore, he would like to become his mentor. Will he accept his offer? At this moment, Gong Sunlian put his hand on the protagonist's shoulder and asked, the director as a mentor? Brother Han, even the 5 great families can't afford this. Let him agree. The protagonist hit his chest with his fist and ordered the director not to worry. As long as he is alive, he will do his best to protect people from monsters. Director Su smiled and replied, good, it's not for nothing that he liked him. From now on, their squad will be called Observers. Lin Han clenched his fist and asked, Observers? He likes it, thank him, mentor. The director threw a token towards them and said that he needed them all to become stronger as soon as possible, so he would not spare them. He ordered them to hold on to it and go to the quest distribution hall tomorrow and take the one he had prepared for them. This would help them gain combat experience. The protagonist caught the token and cried out, yes, mentor. The next morning, the team members were standing in the distribution hall. Lin Han held out the token and said hello. He said that they would like to receive this quest. The girl at the counter smiled and replied, okay, just a second. She asked thoughtfully, are they sure they want to take this quest? The protagonist asked in surprise, what was wrong with this quest? The girl pointed her finger at a line in the book and said that he could take a look himself. Yuanshi walked forward and said yes, he would like to take a look at what's in there. He suddenly turned pale and asked, what? Gong Sunlian came closer and asked, what's wrong, what's in there? The protagonist looked at the book and asked, why are they so upset, is it really that bad? Gong Sunlian put his hands to his chin and said, Brother Han, maybe he didn't know this, but A-rank quests are usually only taken by teams that are all late-stage diamond rank. He suggested taking another quest. Yuanshi wiped his tears with a handkerchief and said, except for their monster Lin Han, the rest of their team are just average. The protagonist pointed to the book and said, it says that terrible incidents have started to happen in the border county of Mongshan, which have already claimed the lives of dozens of people. And strangely enough, all the victims were missing hearts. The guards have already conducted an investigation, but they have not achieved any results. He doesn't think they have anything to worry about. This quest is more of an investigation than a battle with an incredibly strong monster. Besides, it was left to them by their mentor, so they can't be here. Gong Sunlian put his hand to his chin and replied, yes, such tasks require intelligence and ingenuity, not brute force. In addition, the higher the rank of the task, the more points they will pay. And points for them, this is the only way to become stronger. Lin Han put his hands on the shoulders of the guys and smiled and said, no need to worry so much, he will be with them. They are coming already. After some time, they rode on a bus along the river and rocky shore. The protagonist closed his eyes and imagined the settlement said, Manshan County, this is one of the border counties of the empire. The city itself is located on the top of a mountain, and at the foot of this defensive wall is built, protecting people from countless local monsters. He coughed and said not to forget about banal caution. They do not want any of them to accidentally fall off this mountain, right? Tengshinchi grabbed him by the t-shirt and with tears in his eyes asked, can they still refuse? The protagonist answered, no. He opened the book and said, there have been 26 murders in Manshan recently. There were no injuries found on the victims' bodies, however, all of them were missing hearts. The boys listened to him attentively. Lin Han added, the Shimeng Academy had already sent a squad of gold stage fighters there, but none of them had returned. That's why this quest was given a rank. They must be extremely careful. Gong Sunlian said thoughtfully, since the killer was able to deal with the gold stage team, then he must be from the diamond stage. Each of them, even if for a short time, can fight on equal terms with the diamond stage, and Lin Han had even laid them out in packs. He thinks they can handle it. Du-won said in confusion, but right now they have too little information. They only know why the victims died. They don't even know the number of potential opponents. Suddenly, a scream and a loud creaking of a wheel was heard. Someone asked what was going on, why did they stop? The driver pointed to the exit and said they could get out. He asked with displeasure, they were going to Mongshan, right? He definitely wasn't going there, so let them get out. Yuanqi walked up to him and asked him to wait. It was the only bus going to Mengshan. He couldn't just refuse to go there. The driver waved his hand and asked, who in their right mind would go to Mengshan after what happened there? Let them get out already. Duan asked fearfully, Sir, is it really that bad in Mengshan? The driver turned around and frowned and said, bad is an understatement. His old neighbor had recently moved out. He said that it was simply impossible to live there now. Every day, ghosts appeared there and tried to drive him crazy. The protagonist bent down and asked, his neighbor was talking about ghosts, and where did he live before? The driver asked discontentedly, were they not listening to him at all? If they valued their lives, then they should not go there. He frowned and said, okay. Just don't let them say later that he didn't warn them. He would draw them a rough map and stop 30 kilometers from there. The driver took out a notebook and started drawing. He said that as soon as they entered the city, they should follow this route. And then they would find this house. But he warned them again, his neighbor became very ill after meeting these ghosts, and still hasn't recovered. Lin Han looked at this in surprise and wondered, ghosts, what kind of horrors are going on there? After a while, the guys reached dark buildings, over which flocks of crows were flying. Du-Wan looked around and said, this place, it is literally soaked with a creepy aura. The protagonist frowned and walked forward. Suddenly, a huge creature appeared in front of them and a scream rang out, it really is a ghost. Du-Wan looked ahead carefully and said, Lin Han, it doesn't look like this ghost is going to attack them. Lin Han put his hands in front of him and replied, he felt like it was giving off a strange power. But she was right, it didn't look hostile. Du-Wan arched her eyebrows and said, she'll check everything out, and let them cover her for now. Teng Xinchi replied, yes. Du-Wan spread her arms out in different directions, and the guys sat on the floor in a lotus position. She formed a seal and cried out, the blessing of the holy light, may it grant her eyes that can see the truth, observer. Du-Wan's body was covered in bright light, and the protagonist was puzzled. What? She just copied the power of the rare support class observer, didn't she? What a convenient class she has. Well, now they will definitely be able to understand what is happening there. Du-Wan lowered her head and began to describe her visions. She saw the students of the Shimeng Academy gathered together. And then for some reason they started to fight among themselves. Du-Wan looked ahead and asked what happened, why did they start to fight? One of the guys from the academy grabbed another by the face and slammed him into the wall. The guy's hand glowed and Du-Wan said in surprise, but it seemed that thanks to this they found some kind of portal. Yuan-Shi looked at her and asked, portal, what is she talking about wanting? She screamed, they crossed over to another space. The guys began to pass through the portal, and death was already waiting for them inside. Du-Wan sighed in fear and blood flowed from her eyes. Yuan-Shi put his hand on her back and asked, wanting, is she okay? He told her to end it. Du-Wan grabbed her face and said sorry, she still didn't really understand. Blood continued to flow from her eyes, and she said, some huge red shadow appeared in front of them, and then she almost lost consciousness. The protagonist looked ahead and replied, it's okay, she did well, let her rest for a while. He thought, wanting became ill right after those guys crossed over to another space. Was it because of the horrors happening there or because of some kind of protection of this space? Well, they have to go in there anyway, so. Lin Han activated the all-seeing eye. He saw a portal at the side of the destroyed building and shouted, here it is, he found the portal. The protagonist ran to it, and put his hand forward and entered. After a while, the team members found themselves inside the portal, in which everything was covered in bloody red light. Gong Sunlian-shi stuck his spear into the ground and asked cautiously, there was blood all over it, was it all the blood of the Mengshan people? Suddenly, Du-Wan pointed her finger forward and shouted, there. The guys instantly turned around. In that direction, there were wooden boxes in a large bloody water. Inside the boxes were the bodies of people turning into mummies. Yuan-Shi looked at this and cried out in fear, what the hell, who had the guts for such cruelty? The team members came closer to the bodies and began to examine them. Lin Han said, there are plenty of coffins and no corpses inside. Gong Sunlian-shi turned around and asked, so the one behind this wanted to continue killing the locals? Suddenly, a creature fell on his spear. A monster similar to a lizard with a large toothy mouth was injured. Suddenly, the protagonist grabbed it and clenched his fist. He told Gong Sunlian-shi to be more careful. There was something strange about these creatures. Gong Sunlian-shi thanked Brother Han. The other boys froze in fear, looking ahead. A vampire appeared in front of them and laughed and said, what an amazing reaction. It would be a perfect addition to his collection. Suddenly, huge monsters appeared in front of them, and on one of them stood a vampire. The boys looked at him in fear, and he said, "They are not so simple, since they were able to find his scarlet hell. He will even reward them for this. They will have the honor of playing with his beloved little ones." Lin Han jumped up and ordered them to be careful. Gong Sunlianshi swung his spear and said, "Something is wrong there. What is a master of such a level doing in Mongshan?" Duwan fell into the bloody water and screamed, "Damn it, guys, she seems to have spent too much energy, she can't." A huge monster mouth appeared next to her. A bright light began to come out of this mouth, and Duwan covered her face with her hands. At this moment, Yuanshi grabbed her in his arms and shouted, "Heroes always appear at the very last moment." Tingshinchi held the barrier and said, "Stop fooling around, it won't last long." The guys were surrounded by creatures from all sides, and the vampire said, "They are doing well." He laughed and said that he was even starting to like it. Lin Han said that he only knew one group of people who were so obsessed with other people's blood and strength. "Is he from the Blood Moon cult?" The vampire spread his arms out in different directions and laughed. "How smart! He is a guardian of the Blood Moon cult, a heart eater." Gong Sunlianshi grabbed a spear and said, "The Blood Moon cult means horror, they can't defeat this guy. Let them run, he will detain him." The protagonist said not to talk nonsense. They are one team. The observers will never abandon their comrade. The vampire licked his lips and said two loud words for someone like him. But he was right about one thing, absolutely everyone would die. Lin Han activated his energy and asked, "Is that so?" He smirked and offered to check. He extended his fist forward and directed the energy flow forward. The protagonist turned around and ordered the team to quickly climb into the portal. The guys entered the portal, and Lin Han remained inside. Yuanshi extended his hand and asked, "Brother Han, what is he thinking?" He replied that he would catch up with them as soon as he dealt with this idiot. The vampire got angry and shouted, "Who gave him permission to take away the future part of his collection? He will cut him into pieces." The protagonist smiled and asked, "Cut him, and where did he get so much confidence?" He activated the energy and shouted, "Did you know, it is easiest for him to fight alone." Lin Han swung his staff and used a forbidden level spell, Fallen Intervention. The spell of the Fallen One's intervention imposes 2 negative effects on all enemies, with a 15% chance of the enemy surrendering regardless of his desire. The vampire crouched, putting his hand on the ground, and coughed. Blood appeared on his hand and he screamed, "Idiot, what did he do to him?" The protagonist answered, "Nothing special. He just lost his sight and hearing. And what he sees is just an illusion created by him." He clenched his fist and said, "He won't even understand when he approaches him, and will die before he even has time to feel his blow." Lin Han jumped up and swung his fist and screamed, "He killed so many innocents. Such a monster like him is not worthy of living on their planet. Let him atone for his sins, terrible devourer of hearts." The vampire put his fist forward and laughed. He said, "What a terrifying spell. If he was a king stage, he would definitely have croaked, but he was unlucky." The protagonist clenched his jaw and asked, "Supreme?" The vampire waved his hand and he was thrown back. A large cut appeared on Lin Han's body, from which dark energy emanated. The vampire pointed his finger forward and said, "He never ceases to amaze him. His body alone is comparable in strength and power to that of a peak king stage master, and his latest spell was stronger than some supreme stage master techniques. However, this is still not enough to defeat him." The protagonist clenched his hand on his stomach and asked, How can he be at the supreme stage when his mana reserves are like those of a king stage master?" He thought, horror, this black smoke began to absorb his mana. The wound is still bleeding heavily. But he does not have time to get rid of this smoke. The vampire took out a blade and said, "All thanks to the spell that allows him to suppress his power for a short time." He laughed and said how he loved to break down opponents who were sure that they had already defeated him. The vampire stood on the head of a huge toothy worm and said, "Now he doesn't even need to wish for anything. His baby will wear him out to death himself." He laughed evilly and shouted, "Baby, let him eat heartily." The protagonist ran up to the monster and thought, horror. Even if he activates the thunder and wind area, he won't be able to defeat this idiot. Besides, apparently, he doesn't even plan to fight him. He wants to wait until this thing wears him out. Yeah, he was too self-confident and underestimated the supreme stage master. The only thing that can save him in this situation is one powerful blow that can kill this blood moon monster. The vampire raised his head up and laughed loudly. He said, "This is just hilarious, let him fight. Fight even harder, he likes watching his dying attempts so much. Suddenly the vampire froze and looked ahead questioningly. Linhan jumped up and swung his fist towards the vampire. He hit him with his spear, and the vampire extended his fist. The vampire approached him and asked mockingly, did he want to finish him off with one blow? Not a bad idea, but from what he saw, it didn't work, let him die. A monster appeared behind the protagonist, and suddenly iron needles pierced its body. Linhan turned around and looked at it in surprise. It was Director Su, who said yeah, he didn't think they would be so lucky. On their very first mission, they had to face one of the Blood Moon Guardians. Luckily, he decided to keep an eye on them. The protagonist cried out happily, a mentor. The vampire looked up and asked, Su Zhongtian? How did he become this kid's mentor? He's not very smart, to entrust this brat with dealing with him. He laughed and said, but he was even glad, this time he really caught a big fish in his net. Director Su looked at him and replied, he was too self-confident. He didn't stand a chance against them. The vampire headed towards them and shouted, now they will find out. At that moment, iron needles pierced his body and pierced his body several times. Many more needles appeared, piercing the vampire's body. Director Su waved 2 fingers and said, his strength lies in magnetism. As long as there is metal nearby, youngsters like him will not be able to get close to him. The vampire grabbed his chest and cleared his throat and said, it doesn't matter, from this distance he can still do it. He leaned his hand, which was stuck with needles, on the ground and said, leave him a small gift, old man. The vampire clenched his fists and shouted, as they say, art is an explosion. Bright lightning broke the protective barrier and fragments were everywhere. Director Su squatted down next to the protagonist and formed a protective dome. The director asked, did he think he could hurt him with his explosion? Fool. Linhan looked at him and said, Master, he feels like that bastard's real body is still somewhere in Mongshan. And it seems like he's targeting him. If they linger there, they'll definitely be able to catch him. Director Su frowned and replied, but it's very dangerous. The protagonist replied, running away isn't the best option now. They don't know when he'll attack again. Next time, they might have a worse chance due to the enemy's reinforcements. They need to deal with him right then and there. Suddenly, a man appeared next to them and replied, what a bold idea, he likes it. Old man Su, what does he think? Director Su turned around and said, Bien Han. He stood in front of them and smiled. The director said, in Mongshan County, ordinary people are being killed left and right. What was he doing there? Bien Han spread his arms out and laughed, asking for forgiveness, old man Su. He just didn't expect the Blood Moon to act so brazenly. He shouldn't worry, he'd already evacuated all the civilians from there. And if they helped him, they'd also find the one responsible for this mess. Director Su and Lin Han looked at him with puzzled expressions. Bien Han cleared his throat and said, forgive me, young one, he forgot to introduce himself. His name is Bien Han, he's the eyes of Mongshan County and an old comrade-in-arms of Su. Old man Su, he pulled the rest of his disciples out of there, and put them up in the county's main inn, so he doesn't have to worry. Director Su cupped his fist and thanked him. Bien Han smiled and said, come on, no need to be so polite. He was planning to comb the area with his men today, so they could take a rest for now. The protagonist looked at him carefully, and remained silent. Bien Han said, by the way, if they really plan to pull off that bait plan, then they should go to the Mongshan County Market, they will find a lot of interesting things there. He turned around and started to leave, folding his hands behind his back. Director Su asked, what do you think? Lin Han replied, mentor, even though this leader smiled at them, he can't shake the feeling that he is hiding something. The director closed his eyes and replied, this guy has always been a hypocrite. After a while, the team members were in the inn. They saw the protagonist and shouted, Brother Han, they are so glad that he is okay. Gong Sunlianchi said yes, he knew that Brother Han would be okay. The guys hugged Lin Han and Gong Sunlianchi asked, well, has he dealt with that guy? He replied, not yet. It was just a clone. And a very strong one at that. If the master hadn't arrived in time, he would have definitely gone nuts. Gong Sunlianchi turned around and said, Master, he should have told the Scar that he would keep an eye on them. They were scared to death. Director Su folded his arms and replied, no, if a Supreme Master hadn't shown up, he wouldn't have interfered. This task was supposed to be part of their training. He asked, had they already conveyed the seriousness of the situation in Mongshan to the academy? Duwan replied, no. They don't know what's going on there, but for some reason there's no network coverage in Mongshan County. They simply can't send a message to the academy. The director looked at the system warning window and frowned and said, so that's how it is. Okay, they'll forget about it for now. Mongshan County is near the border, and there are always many strong masters near the border. One supreme master won't be able to cause serious harm to Mongshan. Yuan Shi approached the protagonist and said, the mentor, the head of this county, turns out to be very strong too. He literally transferred them from the battlefield to the inn in a couple of moments. What is his cultivation stage? Director Su remembered how he left and said, Supreme. That one was his former comrade in arms. On one of the missions, all the members of their squad, except for him and that one, died in battle. After that, the government sent him to Mongshan. The team members looked at him carefully. At that moment, the director said, okay, enough about that. They are going to the Mongshan market, usually masters working on the border trade there, so you can find a lot of useful equipment there. They can buy equipment to their taste, and he will pay for everything. The guys unanimously said the mentor is a real benefactor. After some time, they came to the Millennium branch in Mongshan. Millennium is the same guild of merchants. The protagonist looked at the building and asked, is there a branch of Millennium there too? Gong Sunlianshi replied, Millennium is a very mysterious trading organization. Its branches are scattered throughout their empire. Brother Han, does he want to see what they have there? Lin Han smiled and said, of course, after all, he has special discounts there. Yuan Shi said, monster, and he'd better look for something else. Duan raised her hand and asked, she also wants to go to Millennium. Brother Han, can I come with him? The protagonist answered her positively. They approached the entrance, and were met by a girl who invited them to come in, gentlemen. After a while, they walked along a corridor in which there were glass counters. Suddenly, Duan looked to the side questioningly. Lin Han stopped near the artifact opposite and asked if she could tell them about these two items. The girl smiled and replied, he has a keen eye, sir. This necklace was created from the teeth of a high-level monster. The cousins poured their souls into it. This necklace is unique in that it grants its owner a 10% increase in defense. She looked toward the book and said, and this, as he had already realized, is a skill book. Hidden within this is a high-class fist technique, the Thunder Fist. Legend has it that the master who unlocks the full potential of this technique will master the Thunder Fist technique of world destruction. In total, these items will cost them 8 million. Duan looked at the necklace and then said, Brother Han, this is too expensive. The protagonist replied, the mentor said that he will pay for everything himself, so it is fine. He opened the book and thought, if he strengthens the Fist of Crumb 10,000 times, then he will finally have a rather formidable melee weapon. Two supreme herd and experienced border masters, with all this, they should be able to defeat this Blood Moon Guardian. But for some reason, his heart felt something was wrong. After a while, a large energy flow headed towards the protagonist. He jumped and fell into it, screaming loudly. Energy covered his body. The Thunder Fist technique was amplified 10,000 times. Name Thunder Fist. Rank Forbidden, type of fist fighting technique. Description: the heavens will burst with thunder, and the lightning will destroy the entire world. No one will survive the onslaught of the 8 trigrams lightning. Lin Han clenched his fist and thought, how powerful. Now he had a close combat technique comparable to his forbidden level spells. He had become much stronger, which meant that it was time to carry out their plan. Duan turned around and suggested that Lin Han go back. The protagonist turned around and said yes. After a while, Director Su stood with his back to the team members and asked, how is it? Have they found any suitable equipment? Gong Sunlianshi smiled and replied, of course, it was full of all sorts of rare equipment. He got a beautiful spear that could make the enemy make mistakes. This would increase his combat power by at least 10%. Yuan Shi smiled and said, with this new iron claw, he would leave his enemies with no chance of victory. Ting Xinchi smiled and said enthusiastically, and he took a staff with a strong magic stone. It was lovely. The protagonist thought sheepishly, let him not call it all these strange names, but introduce it properly. The director turned around and said he was glad that they were able to find what they wanted. They had worked hard, but this was the end of their mission. Upon returning, he would apply to the academy to upgrade this task to S rank, and they would receive a corresponding reward. In the meantime, they could return, only Lin Han would remain, because without him, their plan would not work. Gong Sunlianshi said in confusion, Master, but they also want to help Brother Han. Director Su replied, this is no longer a game. The Blood Moon cult sent their supreme stage guardian there. Even if they do not fight him directly, they can suffer from the effects of his attacks alone. Besides, Gong-sun, he has another task for him. Gong-sumly, and she looked at the director carefully and said, "He understands, master." After a while, the protagonist walked through the forest. Suddenly, the ground shook and giant monsters appeared in front of him. The vampire stepped forward and said, "Lin Han," and he was already starting to think that he would not show up. The protagonist turned around and said, "There is only one thing he cannot understand. What is he so interesting to them?" The vampire laughed and crouched down and said, "He himself does not know, but the patriarch ordered him to bring him to him, and he, as a guard, cannot disobey him. Lin Han, he will become his prisoner. And then, if he's lucky, part of his priceless collection." Lin Han looked at him and smiled slightly. He doubted it. Perhaps he would be the one to be the captive this time. The vampire waved his hands and laughed loudly. He stuck out his tongue and asked, "Does he think he doesn't know that Su Zhongtian came with him? In truth, he might be even less lucky than him, Lin Han." The protagonist looked up and asked, "Is he talking about that traitor?" They had guessed it ever since the connection to Mongshan was cut off. However, his mentor still agreed to his risky plan. The vampire stretched out his hand and asked, "So what if they had guessed it all?" He became his captive the moment he set foot on Mongshan. He couldn't escape him. The protagonist smiled and asked, "Really?" He clenched his fists and screamed, "Thunder Domain! 8 trigram lightning!" Bright lightning began to spread everywhere. A huge energy seal appeared in the sky and continued to spread these. Smoke began to come out from the vampire's hands and he said, "This hasn't changed anything, he is still under his control." Lin Han looked at him with his shining eyes and said, "His biggest mistake is that he still underestimates him." At this moment, Bien Han smiled and said, "Old man Su, he never thought that after so many years, they would end up on the same battlefield again." Director Su walked forward and said, "Bien Han, so he has finally joined this Blood Moon cult. Does he even understand what kind of losses their empire will suffer?" Bien Zhao's eye turned black and he asked, "The empire, is this the same country that unfairly gets rid of its warriors?" He doesn't give a damn about it. That day, it was thanks to him that they won against the monsters. But instead of rewarding him properly, the empire sent him to this hole. Director Su asked displeasedly, "Bien Han, does he still not realize what he did back then? Does he not feel guilty at all for killing his own comrades for the sake of victory?" Bien Han shouted displeasedly, "What should he feel guilty about? He killed them, but in exchange for their lives, he was able to kill hundreds of supreme-rank monsters. So why was he sent to guard the border? He should have been enjoying life in the capital, not stuck there and shaking in fear because of terrible monsters." Director Su rose up and said, "He sank to the bottom, Bien Han. What did the Blood Moon cult promise him?" Bien Han turned away and replied, "The post of the head of Hanyun City." He suddenly threw the skull forward and shouted, "And the third stage of the supreme stage." Director Su frowned and said, "It seems he forgot about the difference in their strength, Bien Han. Even if he managed to reach the third stage, he still wouldn't be able to defeat him." Bien Han looked at him and replied, "He didn't need to win. He only needed to hold him back while the Heart Eater dealt with his disciple. I wonder how long he can last?" Director Su took out an attribute and said, "He's a garbage can." At this moment Bien Han felt like he was in a box and grabbed his ear. He looked ahead in fear, where he only saw flying iron things and eyes. The director said he thought he would use this skill when he had to go abroad again and fight monsters. But he never thought that he would have to use it against his former comrade in arms. There were many iron spears around Bien Han. He looked around and asked, "What?" Director Su stretched out his hand and said, "Bien Han, it's over." A huge iron pedestal was flying at his head at high speed. At this moment, a dark energy towered above the treetops. The vampire sucked the huge intestine inside, which Lin Han looked at with disgust. He licked his lips and said, "It's a little burnt, but it's not scary. The main thing is that he showed him all his tricks. Well, let's start the second round, now he goes first." At this moment, hallucinations appeared in the eyes of the protagonist. Red energy beams appeared from under his feet and the vampire asked, "How does he like being infected with demon blood? Very soon he will lose his mind, and then completely become an obedient puppet. Let's see how long he lasts. Let him inhale properly." The protagonist sat down and thought, horror, and he is not lying. Consciousness really begins to distort. The Blood Moon cult really owns some strange and very dangerous spells. Now he can only barely maintain the wind and thunder area. At this moment, a black stream burst out of Lin Han's mouth and the vampire said, "He must admit, he really is very strong. If he didn't know about his stage, he would think that he was at the early stage of the Supreme. However, his strength is not worth a dime in front of the secret spells of their cult. Let him give up already. This is the easiest and safest option. Suddenly, metal spears appeared, which the vampire dodged. The protagonist looked away in surprise, when suddenly Director Su grabbed him. Lin Han said, "Mentor him." Director Su replied, "He was defeated. They need to escape towards the border." Bien Han ran after him and ordered Heart Eater quickly after them. He must not let Zhongtian escape. Director Su held the protagonist on his shoulder and quickly ran forward. He raised the metal part into the air and rose into the sky. The vampire clenched his fist and shouted in displeasure. If he had properly taken hold of this old man, he would have made this Lin Han a new member of their cult in 5 minutes. Bien Han replied in displeasure, "Stop yelling. He is seriously injured, they will not run far anyway. If they speed up, they will catch them sooner or later." After a while, a pack of wolves appeared in front of Director Su and he sighed. The animals bared their teeth and the director directed his energy towards them. An explosion occurred and the wolves died. The director put his palm in a snow-white glove to his mouth and stained it with blood. Lin Han grabbed him and cried out, "Mentor." Director Su replied, "He is fine." He sat on the ground in a lotus position and covered himself with energy. He frowned and concentrated. The protagonist asked, "Mentor, what happened there?" "Yes, Bien Han, he is a master of the supreme stage, but he should be much stronger than him." Director Su frowned and remembered the words of Bien Han, who laughed and said, "Yes, even having reached the 3rd stage, he still cannot defeat him. However, let him not forget that they are now in his territory? Can he be sure that he did not order his men to capture his disciples who were trying to leave Mengxian?" The director asked displeasingly, "What did he do to them, idiot?" Bien Han laughed and said, "What a face he has. He sent his thunder clone after them. If it dies, it will self-destruct, and all his disciples will be finished." Director Su held the metal pipe and thought, he does not know if he is telling the truth, but he must check everything. Suddenly, a strong lightning energy pierced him. Bien Han shouted displeasingly, "Old man Su, how dare he be distracted during the battle with him?" He tore apart all the pipes and confidently looked forward. Bien Han swung in order to die. Director Su was thrown back and hit his back on the ground, and the iron pipes fell on him from above. He grabbed one of these and rose into the air. Bien Han said not to even think that he could escape like this. At this time, Director Su said this is how it was. Let Lin Han forgive him, he was the one who dragged him into the matter with the Blood Moon cult. The protagonist said, "Mentor, he has trump cards. Next time, he will definitely not lose to him." Suddenly, the director looked to the side and said displeasingly, "They are coming." The vampire and Bien Han looked at them mockingly and approached. Bien Han frowned and said, "Oh, old Su, so he finally chose a place for his burial? Great, otherwise he was tired of running after him." The vampire laughed and said, "His collection will include Zhongtian himself. He is crazy just thinking about it." Director Su replied, "Bien Han, he shouldn't have gotten involved with the Blood Moon. It will end badly for him." Bien Han smiled, baring his teeth and said, "No, quite the opposite. This cult gave him what he wanted most." The vampire said discontentedly, "Stop talking, they will just get rid of him." They rushed forward, and the director frowned and ordered to make everything shudder and incinerate. A forbidden spell, a meteorite. A huge burning stone was heading downwards. The vampire turned around and asked in fear, "Has he completely lost his mind? What forbidden spell? It will affect him too." The director laughed and said, "He just wanted to drag them along with him." A huge stone meteorite was rapidly heading downwards. The vampire screamed in fear, "The radius of destruction is huge, they cannot escape." Bien Han looked up and ordered to deal with the crazy old man, and he will destroy the meteorite. He sent his energy upward and said, "Let the mighty wind roar, dark clouds gather, thunder roars awaken, forbidden spell, thunder of extermination." A large energy flow was directed towards the meteorite. The vampire put his hand to his face and thought, horror, he underestimated him too. Who knew that this guy also had a forbidden spell up his sleeve? Bien Han asked displeasingly, "What is he waiting for? Let him kill Zhongtian." He asked to wait and asked, "What's going on?" The protagonist stood to the side and activated his energy. Bien Han asked, "Why did the power of his lightning begin to fade?" The huge meteorite began to approach the ground and he screamed, "Horror, his field again?" Lin Han stretched out his hands and said, "That was not bad. It turns out that the thunder and wind field not only strengthens his spells, but also weakens the enemy's wind and lightning attribute spells. He was really surprised when he told him that he knew this technique. And they were also very lucky that their spells combined perfectly. Director Su stood in front of him and smiled. Bianhan cried out in displeasure, "Terrible devourer, let him help already! Scoundrel old man, Zhongtian, is he really ready to die with them? And what about his beloved disciple, does he not feel sorry for him at all?" The vampire activated his energy and sent it upward. Director Su looked at them and replied, "No, only those will die there." 36 Beam Technique, Imprisonment. He clenched his hands and the protagonist extended his hand forward. Huge metal beams covered their bodies, forming a defense. Director Su smiled and replied, "As they already understood, this technique can be used in various ways, good for both offense and defense." He said goodbye to the scoundrels. The stones hit the iron beams and a huge and bright explosion occurred. Lin Han sat inside the shelter and thought that those who remained outside would really not be envious. Suddenly the beams began to crumble, and he looked up at the sky in fear. Director Su and the protagonist were freed and walked outside, where everything was scorched and smoking. Lin Han asked, "Mentor, is he okay?" Director Su squinted one eye, and then walked forward and said, "There is no need to worry about him." He walked up to a large and deep hole and said, "It seems they have won, they can go back." At this moment, lightning energy was directed into his body and he was very surprised. The protagonist grabbed the director and screamed, "Mentor!" Bianhan crawled out from under the stones and pointed his hand towards them. He crawled out and screamed laughing, "That was close, he is crazy. But in the end, the winner will still be him, Su Zhongtian." The vampire said, "Lin Han, him." The protagonist stepped forward and pressed his palms together and said, "They will not lay a finger on his mentor." The light of holy healing. The director's body was covered with healing light, and all the wounds on his body were healed. Bianhan cried out in displeasure, "What? Horror, he forgot that this guy was an altar class." The vampire rushed forward and cried out, he would deal with him. He extended his clawed hand forward, but the protagonist kicked him and threw him aside. He looked at his hands and asked in confusion, "What happened to his mana?" The vampire laughed and asked, "Did he just notice?" He had already managed to infect all the local mana with his blood. If he tried to absorb it, he would have to absorb the demon's blood too. The vampire laughed and said, "He would still get him. Let him give up, young man, he can't defeat him." Bianhan formed a stream of energy and said, "Thunder Claw." Kuei Sanqiao suddenly appeared in front of him and covered Director Su with his body. The director said, "He was just in time, without him they wouldn't have managed." "Bianhan, he won't be able to fight against them." He frowned and said, "This is the owner of the Vajra body, Kuei Sanqiao. Heart Eater, what is he waiting for? Let him do something." The vampire rose up and swung his scythe. Kuei Sanqiao put his hand forward and said, "Strong." He pushed him away and said, "But this won't get him." After a while, they walked forward and Lin Han said, "Kuei boss, thank you for your help." Kuei Sanqiao put his hands on his waist and said, "What a guy, old man Su, despite all their efforts to stop him, he still managed to send a message. If it weren't for his vigilance, the number of casualties would have been unimaginable." Bianhan stood up and said, "Horror take them, he just wanted to take what was originally supposed to be his. Why are they getting in his way?" Director Su walked up to him and asked, "Bianhan, has he really not understood yet?" He grabbed him by the clothes and said, "That day it was he who insisted on killing that monster. He wanted to become famous, to earn a cushy job in the capital. And when it came time to choose, he left 13 of his comrades to die without hesitation. He was the only one who managed to survive. Does he even know what thoughts he lived with all these years? Every time he closes his eyes, he sees their faces in front of him. And every time he asks himself, why did they die and not him? Why didn't he die with them? Perhaps it was his pathetic soul that did not allow him to break through to the next stage. But he did. He rose to the last step of the supreme rank thanks to his strongest remorse." Bianhan cried out in displeasure, "Of course, let him talk as much as he wants, after all, the winners are not judged. However, one day he will still die by his hand, let him remember that." "Soul Eater, they are leaving." The vampire smirked and asked, "Leaving?" He created a portal to spare himself and said, "Well no, he'll probably leave it there. Give him a chance to chat with his old friend." Lin Han looked ahead in confusion, and the vampire stole it. The portal began to narrow, and Director Su shouted, "Lin Han! Kuei Sanxiao screamed, horror, they didn't keep an eye on him. Does he have a second class? After a while, the vampire teleported to the manor, and the people welcomed the guard. The protagonist was tied up in a sack and asked, What kind of place is this? The vampire replied, he was in one of the headquarters of the Blood Moon cult. He sat on the throne and said Lin Han, he was incredibly lucky. If the patriarch hadn't ordered to take him alive, he would have been a lifeless corpse long ago. Lin Han stood in front of him tied up and said, what a sight he is. Are all their cult members such freaks? The vampire waved his finger and said, let him come. The guard answered, yes. The vampire covered the guard's body with energy and turned it into an apple. The protagonist frowned and said, for them, even the lives of their own followers are worth nothing, a disgusting cult. The vampire bit the apple and stood up. He said, this is an equivalent payment in exchange for worshipping their god. Lin Han, he doesn't know why the patriarch has his eye on him, but something tells him that he was literally born to become one of them. The protagonist said not to even dream about it. He would rather die. The vampire turned away and spread his arms in different directions, saying not to rush to refuse. Lin Han, let him show him something first. He created a huge crack in the floor and led Lin Han to the cliff. He screamed, no, he's asking to let him go, don't. The protagonist frowned and asked, what is he going to do, let him go. The vampire laughed and said to throw away his pity, Lin Han. Doesn't he wonder where he, a cursed mage, got his spatial skill from? It's because he has a second class, a spatial mage. The protagonist looked at him and asked, second class? The vampire replied that usually people only have one class, but some lucky people manage to awaken the second class. But their venerable demon god can bestow the second class to all his followers. He said to watch carefully. He will be the first outsider to be honored to witness the ritual of obtaining the second class. If their demon god likes the sacrifice he made, he will definitely bestow the second class on him. Now he is only a gold-ranked altar, but his strength is already not inferior to a master of the initial stage of the supreme rank. He can't even imagine how strong he will become when the demon god bestows the second class on him. The vampire looked at him and said they will do everything to help him reach unprecedented heights. In turn, he only needs to join them. Let him devote himself entirely to serving the demon god, and then, perhaps, he can become a guardian like him. No, he is sure that he can rise even higher. He will become a patriarch. Lin Han chuckled and turned away, saying that the more he told him about these prospects, the more disgusted he felt towards them, so he should just end it already. The vampire laughed and said that no one could resist the temptation of unprecedented power. He pushed the protagonist, and said that he would have plenty of time to think about it. He was sure that very soon he would become their new comrade. The protagonist fell into the bloody water, and the vampire laughed and said to enjoy, Lin Han. Enjoy the sea of blood, pain, and all-consuming madness. Only in this way can he find his true purpose. Only in this way can he feel truly alive. The vampire ordered to prepare for the ceremony. The guards answered yes. The vampire looked at him and advised him not to resist. This demonic blood would continue to absorb his mana. And when it ran out, he, like him, would fall into the arms of the venerable demon god. The protagonist closed his eyes, and a voice from behind began to whisper, it hurt, how much it hurt. He didn't want this, he didn't want to kill his children and wife. But if he hadn't done it, no, he didn't want to. The corpses began to float out of the blood and talk, he had become so strong, he wanted more, he needed to kill more people. He would give them everything, dear God. Lin Han stood with his eyes closed and thought that he needed to do something. If he simply gave in to this bloodbath, he would immediately lose his mind. And if he continued to resist, he would die. This blood was almost entirely composed of demonic chi. He could try to use it. At this moment, a messenger approached the vampire and said, Devourer, the Kaoki Academy has sent 15 Supreme Stage Masters to look for this Lin Han. They don't have time. The vampire smiled in response. He followed and said, Lord Messenger, he will bring him right away. The messenger said, it's high time, they have no time to waste. The vampire clenched his fist and thought, horror, if he hands it over to this messenger, then all the laurels will go to him alone. He suddenly turned around and cried out, what's going on? The assistant replied, Sir Guard, it seems that something is wrong with the river of blood. The demonic chi has become unstable. The vampire frowned and thought, is this Lin Han's doing? He looked to the side and thought, his body is enveloped in demonic chi. How can he still be able to resist it? Suddenly, rocks began to rain down from above and the messenger shouted, "Let them speak, the river of blood is spreading." There was a splash and a loud cry, a forbidden level spell, the revival of the undead. Wolves appeared from the river and rushed forward. The vampire laughed and asked, "Did he use the demonic chi that he cannot absorb to summon the undead?" And he never ceases to amaze him, Lin Han. The protagonist climbed out and shouted in displeasure, "Heart Eater, he will restore justice and avenge all those who died at his dirty hands. Forward, Cerberus!" The vampire waved his hand and ordered his servants to deal with this dog. The protagonist saddled the monster and instantly threw the men in different directions. The vampire said in displeasure, "Excellent, this will be the perfect offering to their demonic god." Cerberus turned his head and flashed his glowing eyes. He rushed to the side as fast as he could. Lin Han asked in confusion, "What was going on? What did he do, idiot?" The vampire laughed and said not to forget that this fortress was built by him. He simply activated the protective spell of this place. Forbidden level spell, Extermination Scene. The vampire looked forward and said, "Lin Han, within the area of his spell, he will not be able to use demonic chi without absorbing it, and the pressure on his mind will only become stronger." He no longer had anything to use against him. He laughed and said that inside the extermination scene, only he was allowed to kill. Suddenly, a huge snake surrounded the Cerberus's body and the protagonist jumped off the monster. He thought, damn it, he had spoken the truth. He could no longer control the demonic chi that was soaking everything in there, the undead could no longer be summoned. But he couldn't absorb it either, the last thing he needed was to turn into one of those mindless idiots. The Blood Moon cult was using every vile method they could. He couldn't fight him with all his might. Cerberus began to strangle the snake, and the vampire stabbed him with his blade and rushed forward. Lin Han looked ahead and frowned, thinking that the Cerberus was clearly no match for the Devourer, and he simply couldn't recover his mana. Was he really going to die there? He had no choice, he still had to absorb the demonic chi to recover his mana a little. Then he will try to use the divine light to get rid of the negative influence of this. Suddenly, energy began to spread everywhere and the protagonist looked at it with displeasure and thought, this demonic chi began to mix with his mana, horror. The vampire looked at him and asked, "Lin Han, so he finally decided to accept the power of their demon god?" He laughed and said to rejoice, "From now on, his body belongs only to this one." The protagonist stood up and said, "Don't even dream about it, vile murderer." The vampire smiled and asked, "So he still manages to maintain his sanity? Well then, he will have to add some oil to the fire." He put his palm on the face of the Cerberus, and blood began to spurt from all sides of its body. Stones rained down from above, and it howled loudly. Lin Han looked up at where the stones were raining down from. He pushed off the ground and rushed forward. The protagonist asked, "Damn it, what is it this time?" The vampire saddled the Cerberus and charged forward. Lin Han clenched his jaws and asked, "Did he take control of his Cerberus?" The vampire looked at him and asked, "Is he talking about his new puppet? Let him forget about it, it only serves him now." He ordered to tear him apart, Cerberus. It rushed forward, and the protagonist did not move. He clenched his jaws and thought, the Blood Moon cult, they are a bunch of terrible madmen. But he is even glad that he understood this. Now he will not feel any remorse. Lin Han pushed off the ground and rose higher. He shouted, "Divine Face, Zhang Shifeng, Master of the Three Blades." The vampire clenched his jaws and shouted dissatisfiedly, "What, the Master of the Three Blades?" "Yes, he is just a cheap fake, nothing more." Shifeng suddenly appeared in front of him and asked, "Fake? Now he will find out, the realm of the three swords." He swung his sword and thought that the effect of the divine face only lasts for 3 minutes, he needs to deal with it in that time. At this moment, the girl was looking at different places and thought, there is no one there either. Suddenly, she saw a battle and screamed. Director Su asked, "What is it, did she find something?" Gong Sunqian answered, "Yes, she found it." At this moment, the protagonist pointed his swords towards the vampire and pierced the body of the Cerberus. The vampire fell to the floor, and his body was bleeding. He said he won, Lin Han, however, he is only happy about it. He knows that very soon he will become a perfect creation of their Blood Moon cult, he will submit to their demonic god. Sooner or later their cult will begin to rule this miserable world. And he will wait for Lin Han in hell. Stones started to fall from above, the protagonist looked up at it and thought, what a restless idiot, even when he was one step away from death, he continued to talk all this nonsense. Horror, things are bad for him, This cave is about to collapse. Lin Han closed his eyes, when suddenly energy flew over his head. He opened his eyes and saw a girl standing in the hole. She ran up to him and screamed in fear, "Lin Han!" Gong Sun Xianer helped him out. Director Su ran up to them and asked how he was. She turned around and replied, "Unconscious, he was badly